started. Sustainability is a big part of my work and an area that I'm immensely passionate about on a personal level. So I'm really excited to share that today we'll be looking at the landscape for ESG and why companies can no longer turn a blind eye on sustainability. The OECD estimates that in order to meet the targets set by the Paris Agreement and the UN Sustainable Development Goals would require a hopping $7 trillion per year. Nowhere is this agenda more critical than in Asia, a region set to become the world's growth engine in the next decade. As this occurs, governments and companies in the region are increasingly grappling with sustainability challenges as regulations tighten and resources come under pressure because of rapid population growth and increased vulnerability to climate change. Integrating environmental, social, and governance, or ESG data, into financial decision-making will play a critical role in advancing the region's sustainable development agenda. As ESG is gaining traction, though, investors still often lack the data or the regulatory pressure to make decisions with an ESG lens. According to the Global Sustainable Investment Review, in 2016 in Asia, excluding Japan, less than 1% of total managed assets were sustainable investments, in contrast with almost 53% in Europe. So today we'll be discussing both the opportunities as well as the challenges when it comes to sustainability and sustainable investing. So if anyone has any burning questions around this topic, I encourage you all to ask your questions. You can just simply submit them in the chat box and we'll try to answer as many as possible. And with no further ado, I would like to welcome our two brilliant speakers today, Jamie Coombs, Performance Director for Asia from Refinitiv, and Helene Li, CEO and co-founder of sustainable finance ecosystem firm Go Impact. Thank you so much both for joining us today. I guess to be here. Our conversation, I wanted to actually start with a question that I think is really timely given COVID-19. ESG investment funds have reportedly outperformed the broader market during the coronavirus outbreak. And at Refinitiv, we've also seen a surge in the usage of our ESG data during this period. So I guess I wanted to maybe turn to Helen first, and then Jamie, you could add your thoughts as well. Do you see the same trend applied to APAC specifically? And how do you view the coronavirus shape sustainability on the long run?
Yeah, thank you, Tram, and honestly, very delighted to be here to share with the Refinitiv live audience. We definitely are hearing the same kind of sentiments across private investors in particular, that Go Impact as a platform talks to you on a regular basis. I think for people that were not so much looking at ESG before COVID, it's probably moved further up front from the back burner to the front burner, if you like. And those who are already investing with a portfolio that made up of ESG investments is definitely moving up front and center stage. And there are two data points I would like to refer to particularly that really points to this undeniable trend. If you look at the S&P ESG index over this year, it's really kind of been up by more than 3% when compared with the S&P 500. And if you look at the ETFs, the global AUM of ETFs that are tracking ESG indices, the AUM has more than doubled between 2018, which is like 22.1 billion, to about 56.8 billion at the end of 2019. So the shift was already happening before COVID, and COVID was sort of like a tailwind that really shakes everybody up suddenly and severely to look at things through a sustainable lens.
Yeah, I'd kind of echo what Helen said there on performance, right? Using our own data, we've seen that Q1 was pretty good for ESG-based mandates and ESG funds generally through our LIPA product. But how it will shape the sustainability agenda going forward is an interesting question. I think there will be some people reassessing, kind of their investment processes and including certainly on the S&G side elements of ESG data to really strengthen their investment processes. So if you look at social data, that's diversity, a number of women on the board, ethnic diversity, and also good governance. These are solid fundamentals for a company that you should be taking into account, pandemic or no pandemic, ESG or no ESG. These are fundamental company measures that I think people will take into account a little more going forward. So I see an increase personally.
Yeah, and if I could add to that, I think it's really a rebalancing act that people are looking at ESG as like an extra risk mitigating kind of lens, apart from just seeking out more investment opportunities. It's helping them to mitigate a lot of the risk that could be involved in the portfolio.
Yeah, and on that S pillar there, just to Helen's point, on the S pillar is where you're going to see a lot of that risk mitigation. Do they have policies around diversity, women on the board? Lots of those S measures are ones that are tripping companies up, and people are pulling, advertisements and sponsorships, and that's affecting businesses on a daily basis because they don't have core S policies in place. And I think, that to Helen's point, that's a great piece of risk mitigation there if you're really studying the S pillar for a particular company.
Great, and I think balancing that risk versus return is really, I think, what ESG is potentially all about. And I think, Jamie, you've actually addressed the next question I had, which is really regards to the S and the G in ESG, and especially in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and the increased scrutiny that companies are undergoing because of the diversity and inclusion policies. But do you see this as just a short term or perhaps maybe a longer term trend that will really impact companies in Asia Pacific, I guess specifically?
I think it's definitely not a short term thing, and I kind of come back to, you're right, I kind of half answered it in the first passage, but these are going to be core analytics. I think for a long time we've seen ESG be looked at as if it's a different data set and a different thing altogether that's kind of either going to generate some alpha or it's not, or it's going to generate some special return. But actually, really what it is a fundamental way of looking at the core of a company and whether it's going to be around in 10 or 15 or 20 years from some angles. So I think, you're right. It's top of the agenda at the moment, but I don't see it going away either. It's definitely not a short term, while the social media is hot for things like Black Lives Matter. I don't think that's going to be short term. These things are going to be core to assessing and valuing companies going forward.
Yes, I would agree with that, Jenny. I think, you hit the nail on the head when you said that the S and the G, because E was getting a lot of attention. People feel that there's quite a bit out in the investable universe under E, the environmental side, and S and G seems to be a little bit more fluffy, if you like, how the number of women on board, the percentage of women or minorities in senior positions. How does that correlate to the valuation or the performance of a company? How do you actually correlate that and measure that on an ongoing basis? But I think with COVID, actually, it exposes so many cracks in our system, like in our supply chain, in how vulnerable maybe even sometimes our capital markets could be, subject to very high levels of volatility. And I think all these just points to the fact that having good S and G element really is beyond risk mitigating. It actually generates alpha for the companies concerned.
Thank you. I guess another question in an area that really interests me is regulation. And I think regulatory divergence for financial institutions in Asia has always been a huge challenge. And I think when it comes to ESG, companies are navigating a very confusing landscape of different disclosure frameworks, incentive structures, data collection methods. What do you think, Helen, should regulators do to address these challenges? And how can we create more consistent and common standards?
I think it's sort of like a plus and a minus in a way from our vantage point. The plus side is that regulators across Asia-Pac are increasingly becoming a bit of a tailwind, pushing the agenda forward. If you look at the exchanges, whether it be SGX or Hong Kong EX and so on, they are really saying there need to be more transparency, more disclosure for the listed companies. And they are looking into like learning modules, building up more e-learning to enable the people with that. And at Go Impact, we work with them quite a bit on some of these learning. But on the other hand, apart from that, there is also a bit of a discrepancy in that not everyone is on the same footing. As you said, not everyone has the same consistent framework. And that becomes a bit of a pain point when it comes to investors, because you can have, a lot of investor education on the one hand, but when it comes to a bit of the data gap, and the kind of investment grade kind of data gap, I think there's still a lot of work to be done in this area before we can truly mobilize more private capital or more actually investment capital into this, riding on the kind of urgency that is being driven forward in the current pandemic.
Yeah, I think Helen's exactly right there. I think you know, from a company's perspective, you know, when I'm speaking to our clients here, you know, a lot of infrastructure exists, learning modules, you know, kind of websites where people can learn about, you know, what's expected of them and how to report and what reporting entails. I still think there's another level to go on the communication there. There's still a lot of confusion out there. I think there's a kind of a disparate, you know, there's a lot of learning, documentation, text and help out there, but it's not reaching the companies, and companies are still relatively confused about what it means for them and how to report. And then that slows things down on a disclosure and data gap basis because companies are confused and kind of slow down their reporting. So I think, you know, it's got better for sure. It's absolutely got better. And I wonder whether things like, you know, the ASEAN nations, some of the asset management kind of community can get together across ASEAN nations and, you know, communicate better, because I feel like we're speaking to Thai asset management communities, Vietnamese asset management communities, all very individually at the moment and trying to push agendas. And it feels like there's some, you know, kind of group collective that we need to do there just to try and, you know, simplify across nations, because that's where Helen's point comes in. The investors are confused because ESG compliance in one country is not ESG compliance in the next one that you look at, and that's confusing for everyone.
Yeah, and I want to echo that point by saying that actually this agenda has for a long time, of quite a few years, been more of a conference and advocacy agenda, but to move it from the intention to action, for it to become a business and an investment agenda that it should be. You know, some of these data gap, this learning gap really needs to be filled, because otherwise with a bunch of, you know, confused investors to varying extent, it's really becoming a bit of a, you know, pulling teeth to try to mobilize them. And I think this is probably something that we are working with, you know, like the Alliance of Futures Sustainable Data, that we are part of the founding partners with Refinitiv. I think that's definitely a step in the right direction to try to pull all the key stakeholders together to see how we can actually tackle these pain points head on.
Yeah, and thanks so much for mentioning actually the Future of Sustainable Data Alliance, which is a big focus for us at Refinitiv. And I think the data gap is something that I'm really keen to, I guess, also find out more. I guess you mentioned about maybe aligning disclosure frameworks across different countries in ASEAN. And in terms of data, where do you see, I guess, perhaps the biggest gap in terms of getting sufficient enough information? I mean, just to give an example, I think biodiversity is a big issue. It's a massive challenge, I think, for companies in APAC, but only 29%, I think, actually measure the biodiversity impact, even though nature-related crisis, as the pandemic has shown, is a big problem. And a lot of the times what I'm hearing from people is that they just don't have the data. So I wonder, do you have any other examples, or can you pinpoint any best practices in any of the markets where it could be, you know, followed in terms of best practice and benchmark?
Just to take that, and it kind of almost kind of goes back to the previous question a little bit too. We need to create a tiny bit of scale here too, because reporting for a multinational company that's based in Hong Kong or in Singapore is not the same as reporting for the long tail of the listed companies or private companies that we cover at Refinitiv. And I think that's where some of the data gap exists, just to address your question on the data gap, Trang, is that the smaller companies, the small to medium-sized companies, have no idea how to report or what their benchmark or targets should be, or what really the SDGs even look like for them, or how to operate within that framework. So I think that's, for me, is where one of the biggest data gaps is. And then when you come on to something like biodiversity, then that problem is magnified by another 10 for a small company, because they have no idea through their supply chain how their biodiversity impact looks, let alone their own kind of biodiversity. So I think we need to start small steps and make it easier for, you know, the long tail of companies that we really cover here to disclose in the first place, and then move on to things like biodiversity, which will be a little hard for them to get their heads around at this point, but I think is good momentum.
Yeah, I think what Jamie pointed to was actually the crux of the matter, in the sense that there's quite a diverse kind of landscape we are seeing. The smaller companies, their disclosure versus the listed companies. And even for the listed companies, I think for a long time it was like an annual report that you need to put out on sustainability. Now, would that be sufficient? Does that provide enough data points and enough KPIs in a way on how a company is actually doing in terms of the E, S, and G? Probably not. So I think there are sort of moves by the exchanges to look at more regular updates, more KPIs being tracked along that. And I think we just need to move from being anecdotal to actually being more data-driven and factual, which is ultimately that level is really valuable for investors, not so much the anecdotal kind of information that we can find.
Yeah, I agree. That's a good point.
Thank you. I guess we covered the S and the G, but I kind of wanted to veer the conversation back to environmental sustainability as well. I've kind of pinpointed a very interesting figure from our own ESG data. So according to our own reporting, 69% of companies in Asia actually have a policy in place to cut carbon emissions, but only 30% have actually put some form of targets or metrics in place. What are your thoughts on these so-called emission intention gap, and why is that? Perhaps Jamie, I could start with you.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point, because countries that have scored or generally score well for across the E section, and I look at Australia as one of these, right, have scored fairly badly. When we look at the gap between setting a policy, yes, I will reduce my water resource usage, versus how much I will actually reduce it by and by when. So whereas kind of lots of the larger companies in Hong Kong, Singapore, Australia are doing very well on some of their ESG measures generally, there is this gap between them setting policy, setting water resource usage, energy consumption policies, but then never setting a target. And as we all know, in our day-to-day inboxes, if we don't set a target to reply to our emails, then more often than not, then we don't get there. So it's a really interesting gap, and I think it's actually exacerbated in certain areas. Certainly in Australia, part of the issue is just where their productivity comes from, and it's a mining heavy and aggregates heavy economy, and an export heavy economy to China too. And I think that makes it much harder to quantify what you're doing, how you're doing it, and to put targets in place. Whereas for financial services, if you know kind of what your building is doing and how energy efficient your buildings and water is, that's a little easier to put your arms around than an Australian mining company that might have 4 or 5 different locations in Australia, maybe even in Africa too, and it becomes a much bigger issue for them to measure. And I think the measurement is the thing. If you can't measure, then how do you even begin to set a sensible target? So yeah, that's it for me. It's a really interesting subject actually that came out of our report. It's a good question.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think what cannot be measured is difficult to manage, right? So unless you have meaningful measures and KPIs that are being held as pillars of accountability, you will always have this intention gap. And I think this intention gap doesn't exist only in environmental carbon emissions. I think it also exists across different ESG pillars, honestly, like inclusion and all that. If you don't have very specific KPIs and you can track it across companies, whether you are big and small, and try to build something that might correlate this back to the performance, I think you will continue to have things like, oh, does it really matter that much? Knowing how busy everyone is and how time poor in this, tech-driven world, a lot of these that are not specifically KPIs just get slipped in between the cracks. So I suspect that is something happening here. And one example I want to quote is that for some of the real estate companies that I've noticed across here, there are many legacy buildings that are not energy efficient. To retrofit them for energy efficiency would obviously be very costly. So what they're looking at is probably more like, okay, for the new buildings that we're putting up, we better make sure that they comply to certain like LEED gold standards or something like that.
Yeah.
But for the older buildings, that will always become a pain point. You know, to what extent can you retrofit them in order that your company has reduced the emission and the energy is more the energy usage is more efficient. So you will have all these very diverse problems to tackle with.
Yeah, it's just to add to that also, and it was a point I was going to bring up maybe a bit later, but I think as investors get more active with their investments and with the companies that they are, deeply involved in and deeply kind of, their performance is hinging on. As investors get more active with their ownership and talking to boards and talking to people, they're going to demand results a little bit quicker. So as we look, with one of the questions about what one of the trends might be, I think something that will be on the increase is that kind of active ownership pressure and very active involvement with what some of the targets are, how they've been set and how the policies have been made and how companies are tracking against them. And when you have investor pressure like that, you will soon see targets being made and targets possibly even being reached, which is where we want to get to.
Thank you. And I guess, Helen, you mentioned real estate, and I just wanted to maybe ask you both, would you be able to identify one sector or even an organization that's doing really well when it comes to measuring, when it comes to, walking the talk and putting policies in place around sustainability and ESG that, maybe others could learn from?
That's a tough question, actually, because, there are there's quite a bit of divergence here. I think, it's important to realize that within a company, sustainability is not just the business of the head of sustainability. It's not just the business of the head of sustainable finance. It's really, that kind of, across the board, embracing this and everybody understanding that they all have a role to play in this. And I think that really, translates into some of the KPIs that we, Jamie and I talked about a little bit earlier, and how you can actually wrap a more robust set of metrics around it. And I think until you actually move towards that, a more, company-wide adoption of this, I think some of the KPIs will still remain like it's someone else's business.
Jamie, anything to add from your end?
Yeah, just really, when you go back to whether there's one sector or one area, I just think it's always good to remind ourselves where we came from on some of these targets, right? When you look at our report in isolation for this year, it looks like less than half of companies in particular regions have a target against a policy. If you look at where we've come over the last 5 years, I think looking at our report of 2 years ago, I think it was less than 17% of companies had a target. So we are making inroads in the right direction. This isn't, necessarily a super negative story. It's one that needs addressing, but we've come from a place and we're on a journey that's heading in the right direction. I just really wanted to point that out because whilst in isolation this year, the numbers don't look fantastic and we can definitely do better. As a region, we've come a long way already, actually, and some of the countries like Hong Kong, Singapore, and Thailand too, have actually made great inroads. If you actually break down APAC in that emissions intention gap, and you start to look at the underlying countries, some countries have made really good progress. So just always good to have a positive kind of slant on that report.
And talking about positivity, I just wanted to share the results of the poll. Actually, 80% of our audience thinks that sustainability will have a bigger focus post-COVID-19. So that's a pretty optimistic take and something I personally agree with. And I wanted to kind of turn to you both for your opinions. But before that, I just wanted to remind our audience as well that you can ask your questions. I think I've seen one question that I'll ask after this one. But if you have any other questions, just pop them into the chat box and we have a couple of more minutes to answer them. But yeah, I guess Helen and Jamie, what are your thoughts? Will sustainability remain as a bigger focus or will it take a backseat?
Yeah,
I think. No, sorry. Okay.
That was bound to happen at some point.
Definitely. Yeah, I think definitely it will remain a much bigger focus. It's not just a buzzword that will go away after COVID has returned to some kind of a new normal, which, by the way, I don't believe it will look anything like the old normal. that we left behind. But I think the reason for us, being optimistic, apart from being practitioners in the field, is the fact that people have realized the urgency in many ways of looking at this systemically, across our capital markets, across our supply chains and systems. COVID has been a bit of a wake-up call, and this is definitely, people are shaken up enough to, not to say, okay, I can go back to whatever I was doing before. So I'm glad that the audience agree with me on that. I'll be interested to hear what Jamie's thoughts are on this.
Yeah, so I think Helen's right. The urgency is there. The environmental urgency and pressure is there, absolutely. And there are plenty of people, way more qualified than me to talk about the environmental pressures. Helen is one of them. Going back to the data, which is more my kind of focus, I'd love to see this be less of a separate thing. Going back to my original point, I think ESG will just become a fundamental way of looking at a company. You will not be able to assess the value of a company without looking at these factors that we currently see as something else and new. I think that will go away. These will be just fundamental data sets as to how you look at a company. And when we're there, I think the results will speak for themselves.
Yeah, and I could just add to that. I think I'm hearing a lot louder voice from the capital owners, particularly the private capital owners, family offices, and so on, that are saying they want to take a more holistic approach towards ESG investments. We're not asking the bankers, do you have a new product apart from the green bond, apart from green financing that your bank is doing? What else is there? So they're taking a more portfolio, the whole, asset allocation approach to this, which means that data is actually more and more important. How can you make effective asset allocation without the proper support of data? So, that's just, another piece of evidence. I want to echo Jamie's point just now.
Thank you. And I guess there's a question from the audience, which I think will be a nice way as well to wrap up our discussion. The audience member is asking what your top one prediction would be, or I guess the key trend market players should watch out for when it comes to sustainability and sustainable investing in APAC. Perhaps Jamie, I could start with you, and then Helen, you could add to it.
Yeah, I'd probably go back to my point on active ownership. A lot of I think a recent Reuters poll suggested that half of the people polled, asset managers, suggested that active ownership was top of their mind, but only 1% of them were really doing anything about it and taking a really active role in what's going on a particular company that they cover. So I think active ownership, kind of an increase in that real kind of in that kind of approach, and then possibly also to Helen's point around wealth, just that move away in the wealth space from exclusion lists and please do not buy this stock and please do not buy that, and genuine asset allocations, genuine understanding of the subject matter from family offices and wealth institutions as we move forward, I think is something you'll see increase certainly in region over the next year or so.
Yes, thank you, Jamie. I was going to add on to that. My point was that, from the wealth side, from the capital owner side, I think the trend is definitely moving towards, apart from exclusion, can we look at more net positive impact that has been driven from my capital, from my investments? So the net positive impact is actually, a very loud and clear demand from capital owners that the finance industry as a whole has to find a way to address. Whether it's clearer and more robust set of data or a better structured set of investment offering. I think that net positive impact, what can my capital do to drive that, apart from just excluding this or mitigating that? I think that is definitely the next trend that we'll see.
Very interesting. And I think that relates to this shift potentially to impact investing. And I think we could spend hours on that topic as well. But I would want to squeeze in one final question before we wrap up. And it's around the Belt and Road Initiative, which is really, really critical to this part of the world. So the question is, do you have any opinion on how COVID-19 will impact BRI on the long run? Perhaps Jamie, do you wanna address this question, and then I don't know if Helen, do you have any thoughts as well?
I don't necessarily have a view yet as to how COVID's going to play out for BRI projects. What I would say is though that some of the pension funds and clients that we speak to on a regular basis at Refinitiv are heavily invested in those projects and are increasingly asking how they can assess the green nature of those kind of projects. Now, I think any project that's sending in thousands of trucks in to build a bridge or build a road is going to be fairly difficult to claim is necessarily immediately green or otherwise. But what I do see is that, for attracting money into those projects, wherever that money is coming from, be that from pension funds or anywhere else, that money is going to come with the green mandates that Helen's been talking about, even down at the wealth level. But it's going to come with those greener mandates and green kind of credentials that are needed. And so I think you will see those BRI projects maybe begin to operate in a different way going forward. I mean, more immediately, but going forward, you may see a bit of a change on how BRI is handled.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, which I agree with, I think people are increasingly scrutinizing how green is the project, when they invest in it. But they're also increasingly looking at what are some of the measures that these programs might put in place in order to deflect or some of the risk that could be involved in terms of it, being green or not. And infrastructure projects are typically not the most easy, if you like, to identify as green. And I think that's probably when some of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals could come in as a broader set of framework to wrap around this.
Thanks so much. And I wish we had more time to discuss further. There's a lot of, I think, insight and learning from what you both have shared. But I think time is up. So I wanted to thank you both for your time and your participation. And huge thanks to everyone as well for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to find out more about this topic, I encourage you to download our Financing a Sustainable Future in Asia report, which you can access by scanning the QR code once again on the screen or by clicking on the link that we've shared in the comments section. With no further ado, I guess, thank you again so much for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you at our next Perspectives Live. Thank you and take care.